Blue and red lights danced across the water as officers stormed up our driveway, neighbors whispering like they'd just witnessed a felony. The accusation? My wife had destroyed community property by replacing a rusty old padlock on our cabin gate, a $10 lock. That's what triggered the screaming, the finger-pointing, and a 911 call from the self-appointed queen of the HOA. One moment, my wife was holding a brand new lock. The next, she was treated like a criminal under flashing sirens. How does something so small spiral into a night that changed the entire neighborhood? Stick around, because what happened next shocked everyone on that lake. Our lake cabin was never meant to be a battleground. It was a retreat, a piece of history passed down through my family, tucked away on the quiet edge of the water where mornings smelled of pine and evenings carried the hum of crickets. When my wife and I first started spending weekends there, we thought we had found peace. The cabin itself was modest, its wood weathered from decades of storms, but it carried memories in every board. Inside, you could still see faint notches on the doorframe from when my grandfather measured my dad's height as a boy. To us, it wasn't just property. It was a legacy. Life around the lake had its rhythm. Most of the neighbors were friendly enough, older. Couples who came for fishing trips, young families escaping the city grind. A mix of people who all shared one common bond, the water. There were dockside barbecues, kids learning to paddle kayaks, and lazy afternoons where you could sit on the porch and hear nothing but laughter floating across the shoreline. For a while, it felt like the perfect balance between privacy and community. But then there were the rules, the so-called homeowners association, a cluster of individuals who seemed less interested in preserving harmony and more obsessed with controlling every minor detail. Trash cans had to be rolled to the curb at exactly 7 a.m. Docks couldn't be painted without a stamped form of approval. Even the color of your deck chairs somehow fell under their jurisdiction. It was laughable at first, these petty guidelines scribbled on official letterhead. But the laughter faded as we realized how serious they were about enforcement. Among the rule enforcers, one figure stood out, Elaine Collins. Neighbors whispered her name like it carried weight, and unfortunately it did. She lived 3 houses down from us, in a spotless white 2-story with binoculars practically glued to her face. Elaine didn't just follow the rules, she weaponized them. She could spot a misplaced lawn chair from across the water, and she had no problem dialing the HOA hotline over it. People called her the watchdog, but to us, she felt more like a warden. At first, my wife and I tried to stay on her good side. We waved politely, smiled when she walked by with her clipboard, and even adjusted our dock furniture once after she sent a passive-aggressive note. But the truth was, no one could stay in Elaine's favor for long. Sooner or later, everyone broke, one of her invisible laws. And when that happened, she pounced. For months, we managed to avoid trouble. We kept the grass trimmed, the porch lights within the approved wattage, and our weekends mostly quiet. We weren't looking for conflict. We wanted a sanctuary, not a spectacle. But then came the lock. The cabin's gate had a chain on it. The same one my grandfather had secured years ago, still clamped shut with a lock so rusted it barely turned. It was more decoration than protection. One Saturday, as we unloaded groceries, my wife tugged on it and the thing crumbled in her hands. Flakes of rust scattering onto the gravel. She laughed, pulled a new lock from the car, and snapped it into place like it was nothing. To us, it wasn't a decision. It was maintenance, a simple, obvious fix. What we didn't know was that Elaine saw it differently. In her eyes, that padlock wasn't ours to change. It was community property. She claimed it belonged to the HOA, even though the gate clearly marked the entrance to our land. Somehow, in her twisted logic, a $10 lock symbolized an attack on her authority. And that's when the whispers started. The quiet, watchful eyes from across the lake, the sudden feeling that every move we made was under scrutiny. Looking back, the signs were there. Elaine's sharp glances when she passed our driveway. The way she lingered too long by the gate, scribbling notes in that ever-present binder. At the time, we brushed it off, telling ourselves she was just eccentric, just nosy. But we underestimated her obsession, because that lock, something so trivial, so laughably insignificant, would become the spark that ignited a storm of sirens, accusations, and the most humiliating scene we'd ever endured in front of our neighbors. And we had no idea just how far Elaine was willing to go to prove she had control. The padlock should have been the end of it, a harmless fix, nothing more than replacing a piece of rusted metal with something that actually worked. But Elaine didn't see it that way. To her, it was a line in the sand, a chance to prove that. She was the one who decided what happened in our neighborhood, not us. It started with a letter. A neatly folded HOA-branded envelope slipped under our cabin door like some legal curse. Inside, typed in stiff formal language, it claimed we had altered community property without authorization and demanded we restore the original locking mechanism immediately. My wife laughed when she read it, holding the flimsy piece of paper between her fingers as if it were a bad joke. But then she looked at me, her smile fading. "They can't be serious, right?" I wanted to reassure her, to say it was just Elaine overstepping again, but I knew better. With Elaine, everything was serious. The following weekend, we came back to find a bright orange violation notice stapled to our gate. In bold capital letters, it warned us of escalating fines if we didn't comply. Beneath it was Elaine's familiar scrawl in pen. HOA rules are not optional. That's when the harassment began. At first, it was little things. Anonymous complaints filed about our improper trash storage, though our bins were neatly tucked in the shed. Then came a warning about noise disturbances, even though we hadn't had a single guest in weeks. Elaine had clearly decided that the padlock wasn't just an issue, it was the wedge she'd used to wedge us out. One morning, as my wife watered the flowers by the porch, a white SUV rolled to a stop by our driveway. The window rolled down and Elaine's face appeared, framed by oversized sunglasses. She didn't even bother with small talk. "That lock needs to come off," she snapped. "It sets a bad precedent. If one family changes things without approval, everyone will think they can." My wife stood her ground. "It's our gate, our cabin, our lock." Elaine's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "You'll regret that." Then she drove off, leaving behind the faint smell of her perfume and a chill that lingered long after. From that moment on, Elaine turned every minor detail of our lives into ammunition. A letter claimed our porch light was too bright and disruptive, too lakefront harmony. Another accused us of violating landscaping rules because a wild vine had crept along the fence. Fines started arriving. $50 here, $75 there, escalating to hundreds for infractions that barely made sense. Each notice carried the same mechanical phrasing but felt deeply personal. It was like death by 1,000 paper cuts. But Elaine wasn't satisfied with paper alone. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch, I noticed her pacing at the edge of our property, clipboard in hand, scribbling furiously. When I called out, asking if there was a problem, she only smirked and walked away. That night, we found a notice accusing us of obstructing a community pathway because we had moved a bench a few feet closer to the water. The absurdity was infuriating, but it was also isolating. Every time we arrived at the cabin, neighbors seemed to look at us differently. Some sympathetic, others cautious, as if merely being friendly with us would put them on Elaine's radar. The tension seeped into our weekends, turning what was supposed to be our refuge into a minefield. Then came the fines hearing. We were summoned to appear before the HOA board, a panel of 6 neighbors sitting behind folding tables in the community center. Elaine sat smugly at the end, her binder stacked high with evidence. Photographs of our gate, copies of violation notices, even a time-stamped log, she claimed, proved when we had ignored warnings. My wife tried to keep calm as we explained the situation. The lock was broken, but it had been replaced for safety. The gate wasn't community property. It was the entrance to land deeded in my family's name. But every time we spoke, Elaine interrupted, insisting that rules are rules, and that exceptions cannot be tolerated. Finally, one of the board members cleared his throat. "We'll issue a ruling within the week." Elaine's eyes glittered as we left the room, and I realized then she wasn't after a fine. She was after humiliation. A few days later, the letter arrived, $500 in fines, payable within 30 days, or further enforcement action would be taken. My wife was livid. $500 for a padlock? I wanted to believe it would end there, but deep down I knew Elaine wasn't finished, because to her, the money wasn't the point. The point was control, and she hadn't gotten what she really wanted yet: submission. The following weekend, we drove up to the cabin, only to find the lock missing. The chain dangled loosely from the gate, and on the ground lay the shattered pieces of our brand-new padlock. In its place was the rusted original, reattached like a relic of defeat. A note flapped in the breeze, pinned to the wood: unauthorized. Alterations have been corrected by HOA action. That was the moment my stomach sank. This wasn't just fines or threats anymore. Elaine had crossed onto our property and tampered with our belongings. My wife clenched the broken lock in her hand, her knuckles white. "She can't get away with this." I nodded. But before we could even decide what to do, the sound of sirens cut through the quiet. The lights reflected off the lake, red and blue bouncing across the water like a warning. A police cruiser pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. Behind them, standing with arms crossed and a smile plastered across her face, was Elaine. "She destroyed community property," Elaine declared, pointing at my wife. "She vandalized the gate." The officers looked between us, clearly trying to process what they'd been dragged into. But the neighbors had already gathered, drawn by the flashing lights. Whispered conversations floated through the air. And in that moment, it didn't matter that the accusation was ridiculous. The damage was already done, our reputations smeared under the glow of police sirens, and that was only the beginning. The officers didn't arrest my wife that night. They couldn't. There was no evidence, no crime, just a broken padlock and a neighbor with a vendetta. But Elaine had already won the first round. She stood on the gravel shoulder, arms folded, satisfaction painted across her face as the patrol car lights bathed the scene. To her, it didn't matter that nothing came of it. She had staged the humiliation she wanted. Our private dispute dragged into the spotlight of sirens and gossip. After the police left, the whispers didn't. Everywhere we went in the community, people looked at us differently. At the dock, conversations fell silent when we walked past. At the general store, I overheard one woman mutter, "That's them, the ones with the cops." Elaine didn't need to win in court. She'd already poisoned the court of public opinion, but she wasn't finished. The following week, we received another notice in the mail, this one more aggressive than anything before. It stated that if we didn't remove the unauthorized padlock, the same one she had already broken and replaced, the HOA would pursue legal remedies, including but not limited to property liens and civil action. My wife's hands shook as she read it. "They can't actually do that, can they?" I wanted to say no. I tried to reassure her, but Elaine's reach was long, and her obsession with control made her dangerous. So we called a lawyer. The attorney, a weary man with salt and pepper hair, listened as we explained the saga. When we showed him the violation letters, the photos of the gate, and even the police report from that humiliating night, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I've seen this before. Some HOAs will twist their authority until you either comply or break." "What can we do?" I asked. He rubbed his temples. "You fight, but understand, it won't be quick." And it won't be pretty. That was an understatement. The HOA began flooding us with notices. Every week a new envelope arrived, alleging something absurd. One claimed our dock ladder was improperly secured. Another said our porch railing was not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. Each came with threats of fines, escalating penalties, and even the possibility of foreclosure if the debts piled up. It was a strategy of exhaustion. Wear us down until we broke. But my wife refused to bend. She kept meticulous records, photographing everything, saving every letter, documenting every ridiculous claim. She turned our kitchen into a war room. Binders stacked high with evidence, timelines taped to the wall. Elaine might have had the HOA board in her pocket, but we had the truth. Still, the stress was relentless. Nights that should have been filled with the peaceful sound of crickets were instead sleepless, spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what Elaine's next move would be. Every creak outside felt like surveillance. Every car slowing on the road made my stomach twist. Then came the town hall meeting. The HOA board had scheduled a community gathering to address ongoing concerns. We knew it would be bad, but nothing prepared us for the spectacle Elaine had orchestrated. The room was packed. Neighbors lined the walls, arms crossed, eyes sharp with curiosity and judgment. At the front, Elaine stood with her binder, radiating authority. She started her presentation with photos, giant projected images of our gate, our lock, our supposed violations. She spoke as if we were criminals, undermining the very fabric of community harmony. "If we allow one family to disregard the rules," she declared, "then where does it end? Anarchy. Property values plummet. Safety compromised." The room murmured with agreement, some nodding along. My wife's face burned as she gripped my hand under the table. When it was finally our turn to speak, we tried to explain, calmly, rationally, that the gate was ours, that the lock was replaced out of necessity, that Elaine's claims were exaggerated at best and fabricated at worst. But Elaine was ready. She produced copies of bylaws, twisted phrases out of context, and painted us as rebels who thought we were above the rules. And the worst part? People believed her. By the end of the meeting, we weren't just fighting Elaine. We were fighting the entire weight of a community that had been manipulated into seeing us as villains. That night, as we drove back to the cabin, silence hung heavy in the car. Finally, my wife whispered, "They hate us." I shook my head. "They don't hate us. They're scared of her, just like we were." But even I didn't fully believe it. The war reached its breaking point a week later. We arrived at the cabin to find a giant wooden sign staked into the ground near our driveway. Painted in block letters, it read, "Community Violators." Below it, stapled for all to see, were photocopies of our violation notices. It was public shaming, plain and simple. Elaine had turned our property into a billboard of disgrace. Neighbors slowed their cars to gawk. Some shook their heads. Others smirked. My wife stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes as she stared at the sign. That was the moment something snapped inside me. Enough was enough. We marched straight to our lawyer's office, signed photos in hand, and told him we were ready to fight. No more polite letters. No more hoping it would blow over. Elaine wanted a war. She was about to get Neida won. The lawsuit we filed was simple: trespassing, harassment, defamation. Our lawyer sent the HOA a cease and desist order, demanding immediate removal of the sign, reimbursement for damages, and a halt to all false violation claims. For the first time, the power shifted. Elaine, of course, was furious. She called emergency meetings, sent frantic emails to the community, and painted us as aggressors trying to bleed the HOA dry. But something had changed. The neighbors who once whispered now started asking questions. Why was Elaine so obsessed? Why were we being singled out? Why did a lock matter so much? The cracks in her control began to show. But Elaine wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She had one final card to play, a desperate move that would backfire in a way no one saw coming. Because it was the night she tried to drag us back into the spotlight with one last act of humiliation. That the entire community finally turned against her, and that's where everything shifted. The morning started like any other, with the sun rising over the lake and casting golden streaks across the water. But something in the air felt charged, electric, as if the universe itself was bracing for the showdown that had been building for months. My wife and I arrived at the cabin armed with stacks of documents, photos, and affidavits, ready for the hearing that could finally put an end to Elaine's reign of petty terror. The community hall was packed. Chairs lined every wall, and the air buzzed with tension. Neighbors whispered, glancing nervously at one another, unsure of what to expect. At the front, Elaine sat smugly behind the HOA board table, her binder of evidence stacked like a fortress. Her eyes caught ours as we entered, narrowing with the kind of satisfaction only someone who believes themselves untouchable could muster. The board called the meeting to order. As the proceedings began, Elaine launched immediately into a litany of accusations. She spoke with precision, reciting rules, regulations, and bylaws, her voice rising with each point as if the mere volume of her argument could intimidate the room. She painted us as vandals, criminals even, twisting trivial matters into existential threats to the community. My wife and I exchanged a glance. We had prepared for this. Months of documentation, photos, and witnesses lined up outside had built a case strong enough to shatter even the most meticulous manipulations. We took a deep breath and began our defense, speaking clearly, calmly, yet firmly. Every word we uttered struck like a hammer against Elaine's carefully constructed facade. We started with the lock, the original incident that had ignited this absurd crusade. I displayed the broken padlock, the rusted original, and the replacement, explaining each step, emphasizing that it was our property, maintained for safety, and that no community rule was being violated. We had photos showing the crumbling chain, witnesses who had seen the replacement happen, and even prior correspondence with the HOA that acknowledged our ownership. Elaine interrupted. "Of course." "Objection!" she barked, pointing dramatically at the board. "You're ignoring precedent. Rules are rules, and the integrity of the community must be preserved." I leaned forward, voice steady. "Integrity?" Threatening homeowners over a padlock, harassing them with false violation notices, posting defamatory signs. "Is that the integrity you mean?" Murmurs ran through the audience. The tension in the room shifted, subtle at first, then more pronounced. People who had been wary, hesitant to take sides, began leaning forward, questioning the narrative they'd been fed for months. But Elaine wasn't finished. She brought out her biggest weapon, a series of photos showing our dock, our porch, and even minor landscaping choices. She narrated each image like a prosecutor presenting evidence of a grand crime. Yet as she spoke, her voice began to falter, a faint tremor betraying the first cracks in her composure. It wasn't the facts that were against her, it was the audience. Eyes widened, eyebrows arched, whispers floated like a current of disbelief. My wife stepped up, holding her stack of counter-evidence. "Every accusation you've made has been documented and disproven. Every fine, every notice, every claim of property damage is false. You've abused your authority to intimidate and control, and now it ends here." The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing on everyone. Then came the unexpected. One by one, neighbors began sharing their own stories. The man who lived 2 cabins down spoke of fines for a dock ladder that had always been there. A young couple recounted anonymous complaints about their outdoor furniture. Elaine's pattern of harassment became undeniable, each anecdote a nail in the coffin of her credibility. Elaine's face flushed, and for the first time she looked genuinely rattled. She fumbled through her binder, papers slipping to the floor, her voice rising but sounding increasingly desperate. The aura of control she had wielded so effortlessly for months was crumbling in real time, and the board members were no longer the passive audience. They were paying attention. Questions were asked, clarifications sought, and rules scrutinized. Every statement she made now carried the weight of scrutiny she had never anticipated. Then came the bombshell. Our lawyer, who had been silent until now, presented the HOA board with a detailed timeline, meticulously documenting every instance of harassment, every violation notice that had no basis, and every incident where Elaine had trespassed or publicly shamed us. He emphasized the legal implications, including potential liability for the HOA if such actions continued. Elaine's jaw tightened, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. For months, she had relied on fear, manipulation, and the perception of authority to dominate the community. Now, for the first time, the very rules she weaponized were being used against her. The room erupted into murmurs and gasps. Even some of Elaine's closest allies looked uneasy, as if seeing the consequences of her obsession reflected in stark daylight. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The atmosphere shifted from tension to disbelief, to the subtle thrill of justice taking its first breath. Then the board chair spoke. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the chaos. After reviewing the evidence, the board finds the allegations against the homeowners to be unfounded. All fines are rescinded, all violation notices nullified, and any HOA claims regarding property alterations are dismissed. A collective sigh swept through the hall. My wife's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Relief mingled with adrenaline, a rush so intense it left me momentarily speechless. But Elaine wasn't done. She stood abruptly, her chair toppling backward, and shouted, "You can't do this! You're all ignoring the rules! This is an outrage!" Some neighbors shushed her politely, others chuckled. She looked around, realizing her authority had evaporated. The room united against her narrative. She had overplayed her hand. Then, in a move that will be remembered by everyone present, our lawyer calmly stated, "Further attempts to intimidate or harass these homeowners will be met with legal action. You have been warned." Elaine's face paled. Her binder, once a fortress of power, seemed suddenly fragile in her trembling hands. The humiliation was complete. Her meticulous control reduced to chaos, her reputation in tatters before the very community she had manipulated for months. As she stormed out, the whispers grew louder, not in her favor but ours. Neighbors who had been hesitant now approached us, offering support, apologies, and even gratitude. The isolation that had weighed on us for months lifted in a wave of relief and vindication. But the climax wasn't just legal. It was emotional. Months of anxiety, sleepless nights, and constant vigilance had culminated in this moment. Standing in the hall, seeing Elaine retreat, hearing neighbors validate our struggle, we finally understood the magnitude of what we had endured and overcome. I glanced at my wife, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," I said softly. She smiled, but her eyes held a fierceness that had grown from every insult, every fine, every trespass. "We did, and it won't happen again." For the first time in months, we felt the freedom to breathe. The absurdity, cruelty, and obsession that had dominated our lives had been confronted and dismantled, not with retaliation, but with truth, evidence, and unwavering resolve. And as we stepped outside, the lake shimmering in the morning light, I realized something profound. This wasn't just a victory over one neighbor's pettiness. It was a statement, a reclaiming of our home, our peace, and our right to live without fear of arbitrary power. The echoes of sirens, the stack of notices, the humiliation, it all faded into a story of triumph. But Elaine had left a mark, one that reminded us just how fragile civility could be when ambition and ego went unchecked. And yet, in that moment, standing on the dock, holding my wife's hand, we knew one thing. The war had been won. Justice had prevailed, and the lake was ours once again. But even as we walked back toward the cabin, a question lingered, heavy in the air. How many other neighbors had suffered quietly under the shadow of someone like Elaine? And would it take our fight to inspire them to reclaim their peace too? The climax had passed, but the ripple of its impact was only beginning. The tension that had gripped our weekends for months finally began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of relief and a cautious optimism. The HOA meeting had not only vindicated us, but had also set a precedent. The rules, no matter how strict or pedantic, could not be wielded to intimidate, harass, or manipulate homeowners. Standing on the porch of our lake cabin the morning after the hearing, we felt the sunlight warming the boards beneath our feet, a quiet affirmation that our sanctuary was ours once again. The community, which had once seemed indifferent or even complicit in Elaine's campaigns, began to shift. Neighbors we had barely spoken to approached us, offering apologies and words of support. We weren't sure what to think, one older couple admitted, but you were brave to stand your ground. Another family handed us a plate of cookies, their hands shaking slightly as they expressed admiration for how we had handled months of intimidation. It was as though, through our struggle, we had awakened a sense of accountability in the neighborhood, revealing that control through fear could not go unchecked. The HOA, forced to confront the legal reality of Elaine's overreach, implemented internal changes. The board introduced clear guidelines for issuing violations and fines, with stricter oversight to ensure no individual could manipulate the system for personal vendettas. A new protocol required multiple board members to review and approve any action against homeowners, making it nearly impossible for a single person to create the chaos we had endured. While the structural changes could not undo the months of harassment, they offered assurance that future residents would not suffer the same fate. Elaine, predictably, retreated from public life. Her attempts to regain influence were met with scrutiny and resistance. The neighbors who had once deferred to her now questioned her motives, her credibility eroded by the very actions she had thought would cement her power. We heard through the grapevine that she had resigned from the HOA entirely, citing personal reasons. However, the rumor mill suggested it was more about public humiliation and the looming threat of legal consequences. Our relief was tempered by a cautious awareness that vindication does not always erase the memory of intimidation. Still, it was enough to know that her immediate influence had ended. In the weeks following the resolution, we turned our attention back to the cabin itself, reclaiming it not just as a physical space, but as a symbol of our autonomy. We replaced the padlock again, this time with a sturdier model and a small plaque commemorating our fight for justice. Every detail of the cabin, the porch, the gate, the dock, became a statement of resilience. Where Elaine had sought to impose fear, we now asserted pride. Visitors commented on the air of peace that had returned, and even the previously wary neighbors seemed more relaxed in our presence, recognizing that courage and truth had the power to restore harmony. Beyond the immediate victory, there were lessons etched deeply into our experience. One of the most important was the understanding that standing up for oneself in the face of abuse is not simply about defiance, it is about preparation, documentation, and consistency. Every photo, every correspondence, every note we had kept became part of a shield that protected us from false claims. Months of meticulous record-keeping were tedious, but in the end they were instrumental in dismantling Elaine's authority. It was a testament to the importance of vigilance when dealing with organizations that claim power over personal property. Emotionally, the resolution brought a complex mix of closure and reflection. There were still moments when we replayed the sirens, the whispers, and Elaine's smug glare in our minds. But those memories were tempered by the satisfaction of accountability. We had faced fear, injustice, and manipulation, and emerged not only unbroken, but strengthened. Our relationship, tested under pressure, grew more resilient, grounded in shared purpose and unwavering support for one another. The ordeal reinforced the principle that mutual trust and teamwork are essential when confronting systemic abuse. Financially, the impact of the conflict was contained, thanks to the legal measures we took. The nullification of fines, reimbursement for minor damages, and assurance against future harassment meant that Elaine's vendetta did not drain our resources. The experience also highlighted the importance of understanding homeowners' rights and local laws, emphasizing that knowledge is a potent tool when facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles. We became more informed and proactive about our property rights. This vigilance would serve us well in any future disputes. Socially, the resolution fostered a newfound solidarity among the neighbors. Conversations about rules, fairness, and community. Engagement began to replace whispers and cautious glances. People shared their experiences, bonded over the absurdities and injustices they had witnessed, and collectively recognized that unchecked power, even in small community boards, can have profound consequences. The fight against Elaine's tyranny, as trivial as it might have seemed to outsiders, became a catalyst for broader awareness and mutual respect within the neighborhood. We also reflected on the broader implications of the conflict. Elaine's actions were extreme, but they were not unique. Many communities governed by HOAs or similar organizations harbor individuals who exploit rules for personal gain or influence. Our story became a cautionary tale, demonstrating that persistence, preparation, and courage could counteract even the most entrenched abuse of power. Sharing our experience with friends, family, and even local online forums, we received messages from other homeowners who had faced similar intimidation, expressing gratitude and relief that they were not alone. As life gradually returned to normal at the cabin, we began to focus on the joys that had initially drawn us to the lake. Fishing trips resumed without fear of scrutiny. Evening walks along the shoreline were no longer accompanied by the anxiety of who might be watching. Laughter returned, genuine and uninterrupted, filling the spaces that tension had hollowed out. The cabin, once a battleground, became a sanctuary again, not because the conflict had vanished, but because we had reclaimed it through perseverance and steadfastness. Looking back, the most powerful takeaway from the ordeal was the affirmation of personal agency. The padlock, a small and seemingly insignificant object, became the symbol of a larger struggle, the right to maintain one's property, to make simple decisions without fear of unwarranted retaliation, and to demand fairness and transparency in community governance. What began as a dispute over a gate lock transformed into a defining moment, a demonstration that individuals could challenge injustice with integrity, courage, and a commitment to the truth. In the end, Elaine's attempts to dominate, control, and humiliate us failed. But the impact of her actions and our response reverberated beyond our immediate property. Neighbors became more conscious of fairness, rules were clarified and enforced more judiciously, and a culture of accountability began to emerge. Our struggle illustrated the importance of speaking out, documenting grievances, and approaching conflicts strategically rather than emotionally, lessons that extended far beyond the borders of our lakefront community. As we watched the sun set, over the water, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, there was a quiet sense of triumph. The cabin was ours, our dignity intact, and our voices heard. Yet a question lingered, both sobering and reflective. How often do communities allow small tyrannies to go unchecked, and what will it take for those affected to stand up and reclaim their peace? Our story had a clear ending, but the larger message was ongoing. We had navigated absurdity, cruelty, and obsession, but emerged stronger, wiser, and more resolute. The padlock was replaced, the gate secured, and the cabin returned to its rightful role as a retreat, a haven of memory and joy. And while the echoes of the past lingered faintly in the corners of the property, they served not as reminders of fear, but as markers of resilience, proof that standing firm, prepared, and united can overcome even the most relentless challenges. By the time we finally sat down on the porch with a cup of coffee, the lake reflecting the last golden rays of sunlight, a profound calm settled over us. The fight had tested us in every possible way, emotionally, socially, legally, and psychologically, but we had endured. The peace we now felt was hard-won, permanent, not because the threat was gone, but because we had proven to ourselves that integrity, preparation, and courage could triumph over intimidation and fear. And as we raised our mugs in a quiet toast to the months behind us, one thought remained clear. This victory was not just about a padlock or a gate, or even a neighborhood tyrant. It was about the principle that no amount of petty rules, personal vendettas, or unchecked authority can overcome truth, preparation, and steadfastness. That, in itself, was the lasting impact, one that would echo through our lives, our community, and the countless homeowners who might one day face their own Elaine Collins. Our cabin, once the stage of absurdity and harassment, had become a testament to resilience. Every plank of wood, every breeze across the water, every evening spent laughing on the porch now carried the weight of our journey. And as we watched, the horizon, the question we posed to ourselves and the viewers alike lingered. When injustice arises, will we stand quietly, or will we reclaim our peace, one courageous step at a time? In the end, the HOA, the fines, the threats, and the public humiliation were all just chapters in a story that highlighted a fundamental truth. Courage and preparation can restore order, justice, and peace, even in the most absurd and relentless battles. The lake was calm again, the gate secure, and our lives returned to what they were always meant to be, ours. And yet, as the sunlight faded and the water mirrored the twilight sky, we understood that vigilance was permanent, integrity was constant. And the lessons of this conflict would remain with us forever, etched not in paper fines or violation notices, but in the quiet knowledge that standing up for oneself is always worth it.